Kent Schull is a specialist in modern Middle East history and is currently a visiting lecturer in the Department of History at Brigham Young University. This August, he will be assuming the position of assistant professor in the University of Memphis's Department of History. Kent graduated from BYU in 1999 cum laude with a BA in History and minors in Arabic and Ancient Near Eastern Studies. He received a graduate diploma in Jewish Studies from the University of Oxford in 2000. He received an MA in History from UCLA in 2003 and is currently finishing his doctorate in History this summer from UCLA. Kent's dissertation is entitled Penal Institutions, Nation-State Construction and Modernity in the Late Ottoman Empire, 1908 to 1919, and focuses on the prison reforms played in Ottoman attempts at modernizing the empire in the last decade of its existence. He is the recipient of 2 Fulbright fellowships and has spent extensive time living and researching in Turkey. Kent has fluency in several Middle Eastern languages, namely Arabic, Turkish, Ottoman Turkish, and modern Hebrew. He is married to the former Kimberly Snyder, and they have 4 children, ranging in ages from 10 to 2 years old, a girl and 3 boys. Again, his topic today is Islamic nationalist movements, Al-Qaeda, and the global war on terror. Please join me in welcoming Professor Kent Schull.
Good afternoon. First of all, I'd like to thank the Kennedy Center, particularly Jeff Ringer, Corey Leonard, and Darren Hawkins for making this possible, for me to come and present a few ideas to y'all. I guess I got to get used to that since I'm going down to Memphis here in August. And I'd like to thank all of you for coming. Hopefully this will be of benefit to you and facilitate some useful, constructive debate from which we can all learn. My lecture today is on Islamic nationalist movements, Al-Qaeda, and the global war on terror. Basically, what I hope to do in this lecture is provide a more analytical and what I believe accurate approach in waging this, what we call war on terror, by explaining the origins, ideology, and differences between what have been declared terrorist groups, such as Islamic nationalist movements like Hamas and Hezbollah, and the difference between they and jihadi Islamo-anarchist groups, or Al-Qaeda. There are key and critical important differences between these two types of groups. And these differences necessitate specific tactics and strategies to win this war on terror. And finally, I shall conclude with some suggestions, some general suggestions in waging this war, as we call it. Now, briefly, what I want to start off with first is explaining some of the difference between Islamic nationalist groups and Al-Qaeda, okay, or what we call jihado-Islamo-anarchist groups. One is a nationalist group, such as Al-Qaeda, such as Hezbollah and Hamas. One is an anarchist group. One wants a nation state, such as Hamas wants Palestine for the Palestinians, Hezbollah wants Lebanon for the Lebanese. The other is not interested in a nation state per se. They claim they want an Islamic empire with the caliphate, with the return of the caliphate. But they offer no tangible social programs, no tangible approaches, no real program for how to achieve this except terror, except waging war and creating anarchy. One attempts to care for its population. The Islamic nationalist groups try to fill in where the state has receded in terms of social welfare programs, education, healthcare. The other has no social welfare programs, no education programs. They primarily fund and support and train militant factions in order to carry out terrorist activities. So one has a social base from which they apply and work from and gain their support, whereas another does not have a set social base that is organized within a nation state or a nationalist identity. These two groups, Islamic nationalist groups and jihadi Islamo-anarchist groups, do not work in tandem. Their ideologies are pretty much diametrically opposed to one another. They cannot be fought in the same way, and they should not be lumped together. So what I want to do now is talk a little bit about the origins of Islamic nationalist groups and where they came from. They got their origins, primarily the first of these groups, which I'll call at first were mass-based Islamic political groups. And the first of these was the Muslim Brotherhood in the 20th century that was organized in about 1928. These groups, starting in Egypt with the Muslim Brotherhood, were co-opted by the state at the time and given space to work because of their key aspect to religious and national identity in the Middle East, because they had an Islamic origin to them. They were primarily co-opted and circumscribed to working in mosques and in charitable organizations. They entrenched themselves in education, healthcare, welfare, but were not particularly politically active. They weren't allowed to be. And they spread throughout the Arab world from this point of time, primarily in Egypt, into the Gaza Strip, into Syria, to a lesser extent into Jordan and Iraq. They began to gain power and began to take over from the secular nationalist groups that were in power in the Middle East, groups like the Free Officers Movement, Nasser in Egypt, the Baathists in Syria and Iraq, Jordan from these other groups, as they're primarily because of the economic hardships that occurred in the 1970s, which some of the more senior individuals here will remember the stagflation of the 1970s and the problems that went on with that, and the economic crises from around the world. This caused a lot of these developing countries like Egypt, Syria, Iraq to some extent, and other places to have to withdraw from the ideology that brought them to power. The ideology that brought these secular nationalist groups, the Baathists, the Free Officers, was social justice, economic development, and social justice, economic development, and anti-colonial, anti-Western approaches. When they were no longer able to afford and to support economic development in their countries, and they started to have to default on many of the loans that they obtained from the West, from the World Bank, from the IMF, from other places, they were compelled in order to keep themselves in power to impose austerity measures and withdraw from social welfare programs that kept them in power, that gave them much of their political support. Because, remember, these were authoritarian regimes. They were not based upon mass politics, mass political participation. They were based on mobilizing the population ideologically and by feeding and taking care of many of them. Well, when they had to withdraw from this welfare statism, from their social justice platform, and they were forced to liberalize their economies and open them up to free trade, these developing countries could no longer industrialize and economically develop. They could no longer afford to give the populations these social welfare benefits. This is where the Islamic nationalist movements filled in. Remember, for the last 40, 50 years, they had been working and developing networks of charitable organizations. They had been entrenched in education. They had been entrenched in taking care of the populations, and they were able to step in where the state receded and gain popular support. You don't bite the hand that feeds you in many ways. So this is where a lot of these political groups came from, these Islamic nationalist movements came from. They were able to fill in where the state left. They were also supported heavily by what's been called Petro Islam. When you had the energy crises of the 1970s, which caused a lot of the economic problems, or at least in part, a lot of money flowed into oil-producing countries in the Middle East, and countries like Saudi Arabia, later on Iran, and other Gulf countries, who are, generally speaking, much more conservative in their Islamic values and base their legitimacy in part on this and promoting Islam. they use this money to support a lot of these Islamic nationalist groups, particularly in terms of charitable organizations. Hamas, through the 80s, got a lot of its, 80s and early 90s, got a lot of its support from this Petro Islam. The number of mosques in the Gaza Strip doubled during this period of time, most of it built by Saudi money. Now, and they also gained political support and were able to rally the troops, so to speak, not just because of their social welfare programs, but also because they co-opted the ideology of the secular nationalist groups. They co-opted the ideology of economic development, social justice, of anti-imperialism, Western. Now they turned it to anti-Western ideology, and they made Islam as the culturally authentic part, essential part of their culturally authentic national identity. And they were able to cast the secular nationalist movements, the regimes in the Middle East, as illegitimate because they were secular. They had sold out to the West in many cases. Many of them claimed that, many of the Islamic nationalist groups claimed that they had sold out to the West through these austerity measures, through liberalizing the economies, through opening up to free trade and greater Western influence. So this helped the Islamic nationalist groups to gain more authority. There is also this demonstration, this thing that social scientists call the demonstration effect, that helped spur on and give Islamic nationalist groups more power and more support from the masses. This started out pretty much in 1978 and 79 with the Iranian Islamic Revolution. They saw an authentic Islamic nationalist group or identity kick out the person who was coined as a Western crony, the United States lapdog, so to speak, in terms of the Shah. That's how they were pictured and viewed and represented, and come to power and be able to thumb their nose at the West in so many ways. The demonstration effect was also present with the Taliban in Afghanistan. Here, first the Iranian Revolution kicked out the U.S., and then the Taliban were able to kick out the other great imperialist Western power, the Russians, or the Soviet Union, from Afghanistan through the 80s. Hezbollah and Hamas have had success in resisting what they term as imperialist and Western domination from Israel. And Hezbollah got its start, and its origins are rooted in with the 1982 occupation of southern Lebanon by Israel, which lasted until 2000. Hamas got its start as an opposition group fighting for Palestinian national identity and Palestinian national statehood through the Intifada, starting with the Intifada in the late 1980s, opposing Israeli occupation again. They used much of the same rhetoric, much of the same forum, and much of the same tactics in order to garner support from their constituency, which is Hamas, Palestinians, primarily in the Gaza Strip, Hezbollah, Shiite Lebanese, primarily in southern Lebanon, fighting for a Lebanese state or a Palestinian state. This demonstration effect has had a major impact on the success of Islamic nationalist movements. And the other group, what I've termed as the very awkward phrase, actually I get this phrase from James Gelvin, is called jihadi Islamo-anarchist movements, or Al-Qaeda, basically Al-Qaeda type movements. These, as I discussed very briefly in the beginning, are very, very different from these Islamic nationalist movements. Very different in their ideology and what they do. As I said, this is an anarchist movement. They are not interested, or they can at least say rhetorically they're interested in setting up a unified Islamic state, but what does that mean? There is no program for it. They are, in so many respects, fighting against the man, similar to anarchist groups that were around in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. These groups use terrorism as their ideology, not as terrorism is key to their ideology, whereas Islamic nationalist movements use terror as a military tactic. And there's a big difference between terror being your ideology and terror as a tactic. Military tactics change all the time. If a pincer movement, if a frontal assault, if a certain type of weapon doesn't work, you change it and use something else. And many of these groups have done just that when it's convenient, when it suits their needs. Al-Qaeda and these anarchist groups, terror is what they're all about. This is key and central to their ideology. This is key and central to what they do. Without terror, they don't have anything else. And so there's a big difference with how you fight these two groups or how you deal with these two groups. So in the case, basically, all these jihadi Islamo-anarchist groups and the Islamic nationalist groups do have similar origins in some ways. Part of the rhetoric, part of what they use is based in Islam. They use tropes and symbols and metaphors from Islam to justify and support their tactics and their ideology on both sides. Both groups use this. And they both are in the origin, come from originally from the Muslim Brotherhood. In many ways, you can chart a genealogy to of these groups, except the jihadi Islamo-anarchist groups took a very violent and fanatical line. They didn't get into social welfare programs. They didn't get into caring for the populations. They didn't fill in where the state began to recede. They thrive in places where there is not a strong centralized state with a monopoly on the use of violence to be able to suppress them. Places like Sudan, places like Afghanistan, places like Algeria in some ways, places like Somalia now, places like Iraq, and most recently, just this last few days and weeks, Lebanon, where they're able to entrench themselves in places where the state is not strong. They don't want a strong state. It is not in their interest. It does not facilitate their platform and program. Okay? Whereas for these Islamic nationalist groups, they want a nation state for their people that has a strong state where they're the ones with the monopoly on violence in the end, where they're the ones that control it. These are very different groups. So, what do we do then? How do we deal with these two different groups? I have a few suggestions. Some of them are probably not achievable in our lifetime, but this is basically what I would suggest, things we need to do in terms of dealing with fighting this, what we call this war on terror, which in many ways is ill-conceived, but in many ways terror is a threat, and it has to be dealt with, but it has to be dealt with specifically in specific certain circumstances. One size does not fit all in this realm, in dealing with Islamic nationalist groups and their use of terror as a tactic, and jihadi Islamo-anarchist groups and their use of terror as central to and key to their ideology. With Islamic nationalist groups, this is what I would suggest, and it's nothing new, other people have said it, but it's you negotiate with them. They are nationalist groups. They speak the same language as we do. They want a nation state for their people. Maybe it's a different dialect, if we want to extend that metaphor, a different dialect of the language we speak, but they are nationalist groups. They want nation states. They want something that fits into the world system of nation states, which we all live in, which we're all entrenched in. By negotiating with them, not by giving in to them, that's not the point, but by negotiating with them and including, through inclusion, not exclusion, many of these groups have been moderated. For instance, look at Turkey. Turkey has co-opted and included an Islamic nationalist movement party and they now rule Turkey, the AKP party, They have pushed EU membership into this secular Western organization more than any liberal government that was in Turkey in its whole history. And they've made more changes and dynamic changes for the economy than any other country, than any other party that was in Turkey before, who were, quote, secular and Western. This is important to see that. We've seen it happen in Egypt to a large extent. Jordan and Syria, even Iran. Iran has had to moderate itself in many ways. If you remember back in 78 and 79, the rhetoric coming out of the Ayatollah Khomeini versus what you see today, they have joined and attempted to join the world system of nation states. They have moderated greatly, maybe not as far as we've wanted, but they have nonetheless. Syria has been an excellent example of co-opting and, well, in some ways using the stick and the carrot in some of these Islamic nationalist groups. The riots in Homs and Hama and the brutal suppression of those Islamic nationalist movements, and then Syria's co-optation of them into the government, giving them things like the Ministry of Finance or Economic Development, saying, okay, fine, we'll put you in charge of that. And then they have to moderate themselves by becoming part of the government. Now, these are excellent examples of where it's happened. And even in the most recent period of time, the last 3 months or so, when Hamas, more moderate elements of Hamas, formed a unity government with Fatah, with the secular nationalist movement of the PLO, and moderated themselves and de facto accepted the state of Israel and its right to exist. These are ways that once you join the political process, almost every single party, once it's joined the political process, has had to moderate. Why don't we push this way? Maybe this will work much better in supporting that. There also has to be a real solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. There has to be, and the United States has to deal with all countries in the Middle East in an equitable and just manner, if you want to call it, hold them all to the same standard, and this is Israel as well, needs to be held to the same standard. You cannot attack terror in one place and justify it in another because they're allies or they fit our political agenda. There has to be real discussion and real action on the settlements and the settlement practices in the West Bank, because this is one of the largest detriments to achieving a stable peace. In my opinion, if this was solved, if the settlements were removed and there was a just settlement to the Palestinian refugee problem, maybe Israel will never let them return to Israel proper, but you better give them just compensation so that they can move on with their lives. Israel demanded the same thing and negotiated with Germany after the Holocaust. Now, I'm not trying to compare the Holocaust with the Palestinian refugee problem. Don't get me wrong there. They're not equivalent. But there are tactics and approaches and strategies that can be used. We can learn from one situation and apply them to another. Israel truly needs security. They truly need to be able to know that suicide bombers are not going to be coming in and blowing them up. That's a real legitimate concern that they need, that needs to be fulfilled. So there needs to be serious reform to the Palestinian Authority. And the security agencies have to be brought under one authority. There's umpteen different militias running around the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, causing havoc and basically almost evolving into a civil war state. If any of you have read the paper the last 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 2 months, you'll see this. There needs to be a centralized, strong Palestinian Authority that reins in the different militants. That has to be supported by Israel and by the Palestinian Authority itself. There is equal interest and benefit and responsibility for creating such a thing. There also has to be a viable two-state solution. If you're going to go for a two-state solution, then it's got to be viable. And the way the settlement practices are, the way Israel controls the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and its borders and airspace, the water, the electrical grid, the economies, these types of things, you cannot create a viable state in what is now in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip for Palestine. You can't do it. So by having a real solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, you will greatly tone down and moderate the rhetoric and the violent rhetoric of these Islamic nationalist groups. You'll also undermine much of the base from which Al-Qaeda draws its support and its henchmen or its terrorist fodder from. As I said before, the U.S., I mentioned before, but also I'll reiterate, the U.S. must apply the same standards to all of the Middle East. We preach freedom and democracy, but support some of the most tyrannical and oppressive regimes in the Middle East, such as Saudi Arabia, such as Egypt, Kuwait's no saint, Jordan, and even Israel in terms of its treatment of the Palestinians. Okay? This will go a long way to undermining the support and the vehement rhetoric that comes out of these Islamic nationalist movements and their justification, their supposed justification for carrying out terrorist activities. This will undermine some of that, take some of the wind out of their sails, so to speak. Now, what do we do with the jihadi Islamo-anarchist groups? How do we take care of Al-Qaeda and these other groups? Well, anarchist movements died out around 1920s with the onset, in the late 20s, early 30s with the onset of the Great Depression. They died out for specific reasons. Now, more research has to be done on this, but I'll put out a few feelers and a few pointers first. They died out because the ideology of the day changed in terms of economic development and the state's role in it. Laissez-faire economics died out and was replaced by government-directed economic development, welfare statism, and social justice. Economic development and industrialization within every country so that they could have the funds and the ability to take care of their populations. Now, it wasn't perfect. There's a lot of corruption. There's a lot of problems with this ideology, but it did cause anarchist groups to die out. And they resurged when this paradigm switched back in the late 70s and early 80s, in the years of when laissez-faire economics returned, free trade was pushed, and globalization happened again. So what I'm saying, first of all, there is definitely a war that needs to be fought on the ground militarily. But even more importantly, that's like going to the doctors and getting a pill to try and treat a symptom. In order to cure the disease, you have to do some very long-term, hard thinking. We can't just, these jihadi Islamo-anarchist groups are like hydras. The military can cut off its head, but it will regrow and regenerate unless we take care of the real problem, which is real sustained economic development in the Middle East. Helping these countries gain strong centralized governments with the monopoly of force and use of force in the countries so that they can take care of their populations, protect their populations, and enable them to root out these terrorist Al-Qaeda type groups. We need democratization, but not westernization in the Middle East. They have a specific culture, a specific background. One size does not fit all. It took us over 200 years in this country to develop the type of democracy that we have, as imperfect as it is. We can't expect that our democracy, our form of government, is going to work perfectly over there. They don't have the background in it, they don't have the infrastructure for it, nor the experience with it. It is something that has to be built up over time that's specific to their cultural needs. I'm not saying that we allow for human rights abuses or the oppression of women or anything like that as culturally authentic, no. But there are differences in how they organize themselves, how they look at the world, and that needs to be taken into consideration. One size does not fit all in that. We also need to promote on a much greater level education and economic opportunities for these people. You know, this may seem like a very trite and simple phrase, but if the people are fed and they have an opportunity and have a dream that they can take care of their people and their populations, that their kids can have a future, what's the impetus? What's the reason for them to go and blow themselves up somewhere? To go and hijack an airplane and fly it into the World Trade Center in New York? that it removes a lot of it. There will always be some crazies, some fanatics, but the real problem will be rooted out this way. So in conclusion, what I'd like to sum up with is that in order to fight this war on terror, we need to know what we're fighting. And the fight isn't militarily, isn't limited and restricted to the military realm only, but it needs to be supported and actually superseded by economic development and stability in these countries. Al-Qaeda is the real threat to Western civilization, if we really want to say it. These Islamic nationalist movements aren't. They speak the same language as we do. They can be moderated, they can be co-opted, and they can be brought in brought up to the level of legitimate participation in the world system of nation states. Thanks very much. How do you want to do this? Okay, open up for questions, please.
Thank you very much for a very informative talk. I just have a couple of points to sort of run by you. The first one is you mentioned the economic situation in the 70s, which would have been a factor in pushing for the rise of these Islamic movements. But for me, more importantly, was the Naksa, the 1967 defeat, and the shock of that, which brought to the fore, if you want, discredited these secular regimes that you were mentioning, and also led people, even like Nasser, to have to go back and woo some of these and take on a more Islamic mantle. And certainly Sadat did that. Right. And we know that Saddam Hussein did that after his sort of reconversion, or if you want, by adding Allahu Akbar.
Right, Allahu Akbar on the flag.
So there is a precedent for that. Right. And I think the fact that these Islamic groups, if you want, such as perhaps Hezbollah, who have shown themselves to be able to stand up to the West through their own ideology, and groups, and then Afghanistan was a very, very important set piece, because it wasn't Taliban, it was the whole Islamist movement groups that were able to defeat, if we can defeat the USSR, then we can move on to defeat the next great enemy, which is the US. So I just think that this was a little understated. You overplayed the economy issue, and the fact that if we have a stable economic sort of social base, then these issues will go away. I think there is that point to be addressed, and that is a very critical point. The second thing I would ask is, in terms of these groups, one of them, I give you Syria as an example here. What has happened in Syria is that because it is a totalitarian regime, because there is no civil society, the only option or the only open door for people to express themselves is through religious activity. So the only elements allowed to provide some sort of civil society type activities are these religious groups. And it's like a pressure valve that the government uses in order to control their population. And so quite often when you see manifestations such as demonstrations against the cartoons, and I use that as a good example usually, those demonstrations against the cartoons and the burning of the Danish embassy in Damascus were not a real anger against, I'm sure that was there, but also behind that you have to remember that 2 weeks
anger against whom?
Against the West, or against an insult to Islam. Don't forget that 2 weeks before
that's part of it. That's part of it.
Yeah, that is part. But 2 weeks before that, the price of petrol had just gone up. The price of basic foodstuffs had just gone up. And your basic man on the street is not allowed to go and protest against that. So when he's given a chance to express that, he will take it. And so when these groups come up, they are able to recruit, because that is the only avenue left for people to let off their steam. And I think these issues, I would have liked you to...
Well, I did address that issue of these mass-based Islamic parties were co-opted and given space to work, as I said, in the mosques and in charitable works. And that's where they were able to build their base. And that's where they were allowed to operate politically. I'm not sure. I thought I had addressed that issue by saying that, but I wasn't able to carry it completely through, which you gave an excellent example with. The other issue, but you also keyed in on, and this is where I was trying to key in with this talk, and it also addresses your first comment that you made, was that, yes, economics was very key. You just said price of petrol doubled. Price of bread went up. These are issues where they let off steam, where somebody else comes and helps subsidize and helps the basic man on the street live. Economic issues are very, very important. I'm not trying to diminish issues of the '67 war, which are vitally important to ideas of legitimacy. And I appreciate you bringing that in because it's important and it fits very nicely in with what I was talking about, these Islamic political parties calling these secular regimes illegitimate because they've caved into the West, because they couldn't defeat Israel, which is something I needed to put in, obviously. They couldn't defend their people. They were seen as selling out, though, because they were in the pockets of either pole of the Cold War, the Soviets or the U.S., but I appreciate it. Thank you very much. In the back, please, and I'll get to you.
Thank you for the excellent lecture and best wishes in Memphis.
Thank you.
I really have two questions, if I may. You used a word that you characterized as the goal of the Al-Qaeda. I'm not familiar with that word. What does that mean, please?
I'm sorry?
The
yes, caliphate.
Exactly, thank you.
That's bringing back trying to go back to the early Islamic empire and social and political structure, which was based on a caliph, a successor to the Prophet Muhammad, not as seen as the same status as a prophet like Muhammad was, but as a successor in leading the Muslim community. So they want to bring that political structure back.
Thank you. The other question, if I may, was there an Al-Qaeda presence prior to March of 2003 in Iraq relative to the alleged presence they have here today?
That's a good question. The best intelligence that's out there and the most credible sources that I've read and I've looked at, not being there on the ground and not having been privy to all of that, is that there may have been some elements up in Kurdistan, what's called Kurdistan now in northern Iraq, which was out of the control of Saddam Hussein. He did not have control of it. There might have been some elements who were working amongst those areas, but there were not elements that I know of or strong or Saddam-supported elements of Al-Qaeda in his area of influence, out within the fly zone that he had. There has been a lot of rumors about these different camps, these different areas. One of them, particularly, I've just spaced out the name. The last that were generated there was a PBS documentary, Frontline documentary about that claim that these were terrorist training camps, and individual by the name of Sabah Kodada, excuse me, claimed to be privy to that information, but it turned out that he was not a reliable source. He was not somebody who would have been privy to such information, and in the end it was quite discredited. So I do not see that there was an Al-Qaeda element that's supported by Saddam. Also, Al-Qaeda elements, Osama bin Laden attempted to, according to CIA intelligence, and it's open source on the internet, fact files, attempted to have Saddam Hussein himself assassinated and killed and overthrown. This doesn't seem to fly very well why he would then co-opt and work with these groups when they're trying to have him overthrown as well. So, please. Yes. Oh, you're waiting for the mic.
How would you classify the regime of Saddam Hussein as a jihadi Islamo-fascist type of a group, or as a more nation-state type of a group?
He was completely a nation-state. He was rogue, authoritarian, dictatorial, but he was a nation-state and a secular nationalist, if you want to.
But I think he was more in the mold of Adolf Hitler.
Okay, but he wasn't an anarchist either. Adolf Hitler was not an anarchist whatsoever.
Well, he wanted to control the world, though.
Exactly.
And it's
And he had a
difficult.
program and a social base and a military and an agenda to do that and a plan. Al-Qaeda doesn't.
It's difficult to control, the world.
Right. And obviously Al-Qaeda doesn't.
Well, and also Saddam Hussein wanted to do the same thing.
I
But
don't agree with you with that.
think-
He never tried to attack the United States. He wasn't supporting things of that nature. Maybe
Well, he was trying to attack Kuwait and
Okay.
then eventually Saudi Arabia,
but to take over those nation states and engulf them into his nation state.
which could eventually, and I'm sure he had ideas of going further than Saudi Arabia also perhaps.
Perhaps. We don't know. We will never know now.
But it's difficult to negotiate with someone like Saddam Hussein or someone like Adolf
Oh,
Hitler.
of course, of course. There are people that are difficult to negotiate who can be fanatical but have a specific nationalist agenda. But they are still nationalists. And you can't, and like I said, it's not all about negotiation. There does, at times, in the case of Hitler, there had to be military action taken. But Saddam Hussein never had the power, never had the authority, the social base, the economic resources, the military backing, anything like Adolf Hitler did. They're very different. And that characterization of them being the same is completely, how do I want to put it, unfounded, fallacious, whatever. Because, yes, maybe they're both psychotic, and very brutal and awful and evil, if you want to call them that. Because I would agree with all those, but there's a difference between how they work and what their agenda is and what Al-Qaeda wants to do. Please go ahead.
But the people could never overthrow that situation without intervention of the type that happened in Iraq.
Okay. And I would agree with you. They probably could not.
So it seems
But why
like-
Iraq and not the other 40, 50 oppressive, brutal dictatorships that are all over the world?
It seems like the best solution then was the type of thing like happened in Iraq. And to use that as an example maybe to inspire movements against those other...
Yeah, but it hasn't worked that way.
It
Al-Qaeda,
may.
well, it may. You're right. The jury's still out in many ways. But Al-Qaeda wasn't there before, and Al-Qaeda's there now. And Iraq definitely is a part of the war on terror now with Al-Qaeda, where it wasn't before that. Although we justified part of our going into Iraq based on that rationale. That's problematic. I think maybe somebody else should have an opportunity to ask a question, but please. And then I'll go right to you and then to you.
Okay, I have two really quick questions. You mentioned the United States uneven dealing with different countries throughout the Middle East. What role do you see the United States' dependence on foreign oil? And I'm sure that it's obvious. And how we can change that, and also the importance of the United States in foreign cooperation instead of a kind of a cowboy maverick style.
Well,
diplomacy.
I'll go with the first one, your second question first, and then lead into the issue of petrol. In my opinion, when you look at multilateralism, coalition building, real coalition building that's broad-based, has UN backing, with all the problems of the UN, and I'll acknowledge there's lots of them, that was still very, very effective throughout the Cold War of avoiding these types of catastrophes. Multilateral, getting other nations involved and helping with them is extremely important in dealing with this war on terror, fighting the Al-Qaeda groups and helping to moderate Islamic nationalist movements and fight them where it needs to be done. This type of a thing, so multilateralism is key to it because we by ourselves have shown we don't have a lot of the resources we need, nor the military size, in order to now bring back stability into Iraq. We can't do this alone. This needs to be joint sharing of intelligence, getting other countries involved so we all share the responsibility and the burden. We also all share the benefits and the possibilities of the future that way. With oil, I think it's unfair to say the only reason we went into Iraq was because of petrol. I mean, we have sources of petrol in many places, but oil is a definite key important issue in the mind of the United States because that's what greases our economy. That's what greases the world economy. It's very important to it, and to have access to those sources of oil are important. How it played out exactly in this administration's going to war in Iraq, I'm a little skeptical that that's the sole reason. It might have been part of it, but I think it's disingenuous to say it's just blood, oil for blood, or whatever you want to call it.
Well, my main question was more why we support dictatorships such as the
Oh,
ones in
those
Saudi
questions.
Arabia, because of
Yeah, because of definite oil needs that we have, definitely. 40% of our oil comes from the Middle East is the last statistic I heard. Now, please. And then you, and then somebody was you, and then you.
You mentioned Turkey in your comparison to democracy being emulated in the Middle East. And
Of co-opting Islamic nationalist groups.
Yeah.
Okay.
However, granted that there are various similarities between Turkey and the rest of the Middle East, wouldn't you say that there are different correlations as to why Turkey is closer to coming to the definition of the Western model of democracy rather than the rest of the Arabic countries in the Middle East?
Oh, there are definitely specificities that go on and differences. Everything is unique. As a historian, I'm here giving this big, broad generalizations of everything, but as a historian, I nitpick and try to look at all the unique characteristics of each. But yes, you're right. That being said, it is still 98% Muslim, and our fear in our minds we've attached, terrorism with Islam. Turkey has not had a very good track record of democracy. But they have portrayed themselves as intensely secular, but Islam is still an essential part of their nationalist identity. You're not really a Turk unless you're a Muslim, according to their own ideology. So it's important. There are commonalities that can be used and looked at and shown as a demonstration, but yes, there are definitely specificities that make Turkey unique and different from Syria or Iraq, but there are specificities in Syria that make it very different from Iraq or Lebanon or Egypt, per se.
Which leads me to the next part of my question.
Okay.
What kind of a secular democracy would you, as an American, envision in the Middle East? Because, what would you envision the Middle East being if it would be democratic, as you would term it?
Okay, I never said that there had to be a secular democracy, democratization, something that's specific to that area. You cannot parse and divide Islam from national identity in the Middle East. Those are important issues.
Right.
Whether it's for rhetorical purposes or for what people believe or act or think or feel, that is a significant portion to specific states' national identities.
Sure.
So that you can't completely remove. It's not. I'll go so far to say that I wouldn't even call America, the United States, a completely secular democracy. Look at the influence religious parties have on U.S. politics. So does that answer your question?
I see what you're saying. So would you rather see the Middle East kind of as a federation with each country having its own model of the ultimate democracy?
With something that works for them.
Okay.
Something where there's one vote for one person.
I see.
One person, one vote, where they can participate in elections, have a representative, a participatory government, but that caters to their specific needs, wishes, wants for their culture.
Okay.
That's my dream, I guess, if you want to call it.
Thank you.
Okay, you bet, please.
How does the existence of Israel going to impact on the peace in the Middle East? Iran, for instance,
Right.
intends to exterminate.
Well, they say that. There's always been a lot of saber rattling in the Middle East, but in the end, and this is my opinion where I differ from a lot of people, Iran would never, if they're able to develop a nuclear weapon, and heaven forbid that happen, it would never be in their interest to bomb Israel-Palestine, because they would lose all of their legitimacy by doing that they've built on being the champion of the Palestinian people. Also, it would completely illegitimate them, based as an Islamic nationalist state, to destroy and irradiate one of the holiest sites of Islam. It just wouldn't work. And so this saber rattling is an attempt to garner support of their population. It's to try and prop their governments up when they're authoritarian regime and not really based on the population having participatory action in their governments. So Israel has been used by the entire Middle East, with the exception of a couple countries, in order to continue to justify authoritarian rule and to militarize their societies, saying that, well, Israel is the great threat to us. We can't give you democracy yet because they're still a threat to us. That's been used, and many of those countries have shed crocodile tears for the plight of the Palestinians. So I don't really see, Israel is a problem that needs to be addressed, as I said, to help the populations deal and not go over to the dark side, if we want to call it. But they're not the sole source of it, and neither are they the only reason for these problems in the Middle East.
Thank you.
Okay. Back. No, I'm sorry. This person in the orange, I had said he could go for next, or I indicated.
Thank you. With the Islamic nationalist groups that you pointed out, specifically Hamas and Hezbollah, do you see them, in a sense, with their hardline socio-religio-political stances, in a sense, undermining their own social base that they've developed over the years with their continued so-called terror operations and whatnot against Israel? Are they, in some sense, undermining this base that they've developed?
They can in some ways. Hamas is not very strong in the West Bank for a number of reasons, but primarily because the West Bank is, in some regions, and I'm making a gross generalization, but is more secularly minded. They're very happy with their religion. It's a personal thing. They don't necessarily want to live all of its principles or be fundamentalist, if you want to call it that. So there is tension. Obviously, you see the tensions between the PLO factions and the Hamas factions within the West Bank of the Gaza Strip. You see tensions within Hezbollah and other groups wanting to be more aggressive, others wanting to be less aggressive, wanting to moderate in some ways. So within these groups, there are a variety of different points of view and a variety of different factions. And in some ways, yes, it can alienate some part of their base, and others, it garners more.
Have you seen any research or polls specifically within the West Bank that suggest that Hamas is slightly losing ground with the population?
Well, they've never been that strong in
Well,
Hamas.
they got voted in, but I'm wondering, like, with the political polls and whatnot, do they see them losing ground that perhaps next elections?
I have
might be a
not
little
seen
more
any very
different?
recent polls because of the situation that's there right now. It's kind of hard to conduct a survey.
True.
But in general, and trends that I've seen and what I've seen and read before and know, Hamas has alienated part of their groups recently because of their hardline stance. They are dependent. The Palestinian Authority is completely dependent on foreign aid and foreign support to run their government. Hamas needs that. They're in charge of it now. And they're being forced to moderate because they can't care for their populations. The largest employer of Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip is the government. If the government doesn't have any money, they're not paying their populations. They're in dire straits there. And so, yes, Hamas has lost some of its legitimacy, but then they rally the troops and fire some Katyusha rockets or other things to try and show, see, we're still fighting the colonial oppressor, as they call Israel, to the north. So it's a give and take, and it fits certain trends we've seen before. In the back, please.
I actually just have a couple questions in regards to your jihadi Islamo-anarchist groups that you
It's a very awkward
classified.
name.
Yes.
And it's not mine. I took it from somebody else. So.
Well, it works pretty good. My question is, first of all, I mean, a lot of what international relations is based on is the idea of a rational choice actor, that they're going to make a rational choice.
Okay.
How would you classify this group as actually fitting into that category?
Which group?
The jihadi. Yeah.
A group of rational choice. No offense to, this is a self-criticism to the social scientists, but there's a lot of mumbo-jumbo jargon that gets thrown around for this theoretical approach and this paradigm and ideology idea. Rational choice, yes, the people who they choose to, many of them choose to join Al-Qaeda and these other groups.
Do you feel that's based primarily off of their economic standing, or is the ideology bear more weight than their actual economic situation?
I'm not a psychologist. I don't think I can answer that question, but I definitely know that economics and ideology do play. If you've got nothing left to lose and you've got no future, what do you have to lose? And their ideology of fighting against the man, getting back at those people who have supposedly made your life terrible, can be very appealing. It's not just in an Islamic society we see that. It's happened in many, many places besides that.
And then I guess just a follow-up to that is, assuming this is a growing trend, where do you see, I mean, how do you see nation states dealing with a non-state actor that in their minds does not act rationally, does not make any sense? What is the best way to counter that outside of going in and economically developing these areas?
Well, I think that's the best way to do it, but you also do have to fight these groups. You do have to use some military force. They definitely are a threat, and we do need to protect ourselves. I mean, that's obvious, but there's a lot more to it. Like I use that analogy of the Hydra. You can cut off the head, but it'll grow, all the legs will grow their heads back again. And then you'll have how many other Hydras? You'll have a splintering and fracturing and a spreading. You need to do more than just fight it militarily. You really have to change the dynamic and the economic structure of these places. Free trade is not a good thing for economically developing or industrializing countries because it stifles their ability to industrialize because they're flooded with inexpensively made goods that their local industries just can't compete with. So that's part of it. But, you know, it's never mind, I won't go there. Anybody else? Oh, please, on the side there. Over. Okay, there's one person there, and then we'll get to you. Okay. You'll have the honor of being our final questioner. Okay.
In regards to the military fight, what would you recommend would be the most effective military? If I'm not mistaken, it used to be in the military, right?
I was, yes.
Okay. So maybe with your added academic background and what you've learned, what would you recommend would be an effective military route at addressing the issue?
Where? With whom?
Let's say,
and how?
sorry.
I mean, it's really, no, I mean, it's
let's say in Iraq, for example.
I knew this was coming. I think this was the harder question, but we'll see. Maybe you have a doozy for me. Well, let's see. This is very, very unpopular, but in my opinion, we broke it, we need to fix it. And the first thing we have to do is secure the borders. The borders of Iraq are our responsibilities and no one else's. We cannot blame the neighbors. It's not their country. We took the country over, invaded it, and took it. We need to secure the borders. That needs a lot more troops. And this is completely politically unpopular, but it needs a lot more troops to stabilize the borders, because then you dry up the smuggling of arms and other things, and you can fight what's on the inside. But also with these with securing the borders, you train an Iraqi military, an Iraqi police force out in those areas, isolated from the city centers, isolated where they line up every Friday or Saturday or whenever at the bank at the same time to get their pay, and they're blown up. There's got to be a better way to do this where you train them. You can also weed out insurgents, weed out other people that are inside, put them through a boot camp that we do here, 8-9 weeks training, and then send them back in with advisors. You can't just have a military solution there. It's not going to work. The more heads you cut off, the more will grow back. The idea, though, is once you can secure the borders and get some stability in the country, you can develop it economically, and the people can eat again. The people aren't going to get radicalized in many cases. You're still going to have your problems, but I think it's very unpopular, but I think that's the only way. Just pulling out, it's not going to help the situation at this point in time, but the current approach is not working either. So, for what it's worth. Please.
One ingredient that seems to be missing, in at least my view, is the idea of trust. As you observe the different factions, clans, organizations, and their history for being distrustful one with another.
Okay. How far, what history are you talking about? What clans, where, and how? This is the historian in me coming out, I apologize. Okay.
This is a general question. So the question in my mind seems to be, how will trust be generated when you have Al-Qaeda and those that follow that idea, and the nationalist that is trying to be more moderate? How do you overcome that barrier of no trust?
Okay. Well, first of all, there's one caveat that I'd like to make. I never said that the Islamic nationalist groups are more moderate in how they use terror necessarily.
Okay, that was my word.
No, that's fine. That's fine. Because they do use terror, and terror is an awful, terrible thing. They can be moderated. That's what I said. I don't see how Al-Qaeda can be moderated without being eradicated and removing its social base. The building of trust, that comes with, and this is a solution we've seen done in many ways around the world, of building strong central governments that have the monopoly of the use of force, where there is transparency, where there's economic growth and sustainment for the populations to take care of them. These are ingredients that are common throughout the world, and that's why I'm looking to other models of how it's worked. You can root out these types of groups that way by building trust, by making sure that you have one person, one vote, and that the pie is shared. That builds more trust than anything else. That's hard to do, and it takes time. There's no silver bullet that can just fix it overnight. Tomorrow, Iraq, if we do all these things today, tomorrow, Iraq's not going to be all better. It's going to take a long time. For goodness sake, we fought a civil war in this country. And we've gone through all these different movements and civil rights movements and all these things trying to get a stable democracy work. It took so many years to do it. It takes time in these other places as well. So
The comment then, I don't trust Al-Qaeda.
I don't either.
And they said that they want to destroy the West.
Mm-hmm.
How, boy, that's a hard word. How do I gain any trust from what these radical groups say they're going to do?
Okay. First of all, you shouldn't trust the Al-Qaeda groups. I wouldn't trust them one bit. That being said, I'm wondering if you're lumping somehow together some of these Islamic nationalist groups like Iran and their saber rattling with what Al-Qaeda wants to do. Al-Qaeda wants to destroy the West. That's their ideology. They're bent on it, and they're going to do it through terror. That's what they have. They don't have a large army. They don't have a military they can go head-to-head with. They're going to do it through terror. Whereas, so I don't see any reason to trust them. I don't see how they can be negotiated with or co-opted or moderated. You have to destroy you have to get rid of the base from where they're drawing their support. And that comes from helping the populations get a grip on their lives and have some type of a future. This is where what we were going into Iraq, in my opinion, was very, very ill-conceived when Afghanistan was where Al-Qaeda was based, because it was a weak, decentralized state, because they had room to negotiate and work, and they could do whatever they wanted. That was the problem. That's where places like Afghanistan, Somalia, places like Lebanon, they need to be supported and helped to regrow and get a centralized state that fits and fills the needs of its population. Where in our actions and our support, the war last summer that decimated the Lebanese infrastructure and set them back 15 years or a decade or 2 decades, that doesn't help facilitate a strong centralized government. Now Al-Qaeda is getting a presence there. And now Lebanon is trying to fight and root them out, but they weren't there before.